In this lesson, what we're going to do is spend some time talking about the favourites of James I. Now, essentially, James I of Scotland, or the 4th of Scotland, the 6th of Scotland, should I say, let's actually get the historical accuracy at the beginning, was known for having strong personal relationships with a number of his male courtiers, and we refer to them now collectively in history as his favourites. Now, they were not just emotional relationships, they were also political relationships as well. There's also really no doubt about the fact that they were probably very likely to have been sexual relationships too. I know scandalous for the time, but at least modern historians now more or less conclude that they were, on the basis of evidence, that they were very much romantic relationships as well as they were political and personal and emotional relationships. Now, ultimately, these men, what's important is that these men gained significant political power. They gained significant titles and influence in court. And so it's important that we spend a little bit of time just overviewing and doing a bit of a sort of character analysis of each of these main characters. We're going to spend some time talking about specifically the following three individuals. We're going to talk about the Duke of Lennox, who was Esme Stewart. We're going to talk about the Earl of Somerset, Robert Carr. And we're going to talk about the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers. And we'll begin with the Earl of Lennox, Esme Stewart. Now, the Duke of Lennox was a French cousin of James I. Stewart was a Scottish nobleman and was also a Catholic by background, but he would later convert to Protestantism in time. He would arrive in Scotland in 1579, and he became very quickly one of the closest companions to the king when he was still a teenager. He was relatively very young at the time that he became a close companion. This was before James was actually King of England and Scotland, before he became James VI and James I in 1603. But he was ultimately the first major favourite and possibly his first romantic attachment of his life. Their relationship caused considerable unrest among the Scottish nobility. James referred to Lennox in deeply affectionate terms in letters, suggesting an intense bond. He called him "my sweet and dear cousin" and wrote for his longing and for his presence. So, again, obviously, there is no explicit evidence of suggesting that James ever had romantic relationships with any of these individuals. But historians, on the basis of practice, given the fact that it is known that James often shared the same bed as some of these individuals, and also on the basis of the kind of strong, affectionate terms in which he would describe these people, most historians come to the conclusion that were probably also romantic relationships as well. And the political role of the Duke of Lennox becomes very, very prevalent, very, very important in 1581. James elevates him to the Duke of Lennox in 1581, making him actually the highest ranking noble in Scotland. His influence would then start to arouse suspicion among the Protestant lords, particularly because of his Catholic roots and also because of his potentially pro-French stance. And so in 1582, in what becomes known as the Ruthven Raid, a Protestant coup resulted in the exile of the Duke of Lennox, in which he would die in 1583 in France. And so the significance of this is, of course, that he set a precedent, the Duke of Lennox, Esme Stewart, set a precedent for James's later favourites, i.e. James would take a liking to a particular, often young, often handsome individual, and they would then go through a rapid rise to power based on their personal closeness, not on their ability to have any kind of administrative acumen, shall we say. They weren't necessarily good at being politicians or courtiers. And this would create resentment and instability in the court. So this is the sort of cycle that we start to see, and we see again when we look at the Earl of Somerset between 1587, roughly 1587, and 1645. This is of course Robert Carr. Now, Robert Carr was a Scottish page who caught the eye of James after falling from a horse during a jousting tournament in 1607. So this is actually while James is James I and James VI, respectively. James took a paternal and romantic interest in Carr, arranging for his education and for his advancement. So again, he takes an interest in these individuals. These individuals then rise through the ranks at a swelteringly fast pace and become very high-ranking officials. So his rise to power takes place through the fact that he was knighted in 1607, he was made Viscount Rochester in 1611, in 1613 he marries Frances Howard, a member of a powerful noble family, after a scandalous annulment from her first husband. Now, of course, we're not going to talk about annulments in this series because, of course, that is reserved almost exclusively for the Tudor history series. But then he is elevated to the Earl of Somerset in 1613. And his political influence is, of course, very, very, very important. With the fall of the Earl of Salisbury, Robert Cecil, Carr becomes the de facto chief minister following this particular event. He was closely associated with the Howard faction and the Catholic sympathisers at court, and one of the most important factors is that his lack of political skill and involvement in patronage battles weakened his position ultimately over time. And he would fall from grace in 1615 when Carr and his wife were implicated in the scandalous murder of Sir Thomas Overbury, who was opposed to their marriage. Both would be imprisoned in the Tower of London. Although convicted, they were later pardoned by James in 1622, again partially, almost definitely due to a lingering personal affection that he had for them. But ultimately, his fall from grace was as significantly quick as his rise to power. His career demonstrated how James's personal favouritism could even compromise political judgment and would lead to scandal and factionalism within the court, obviously all of which not particularly very helpful. And then we get to probably the most, arguably one of the most let's just say disastrous of characters within the sort of the courtiers of the revolving door of James I, and this was of course George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, who lived from around 1592 to 1628. Now, in terms of the story of how he came to power, it's very, very similar. He catches the eye of James, obviously due to the fact that he was seen as a quite handsome and charming young man. And then he again goes through the process of rising to power and becomes a very significant figure during his reign. He was backed, in fact, by the anti-Howard factions, who actually wanted to replace Carr with somebody who they saw to be a more controllable favourite. So, of course, a number of other factions within court were very amply aware of the fact that James would take a liking to one individual and they would then rise to power and gain significant influence. So they started to use that to their advantage, and they started to use people like Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, to try and replace the ones that they didn't like. The anti-Howard factions replaced Carr with a more controllable favourite. Just like with Carr and just like with the Duke of Lennox, we see a rapid ascent. He becomes the Gentleman of the Bedchamber in 1615. He is then knighted in 1616. He is made Viscount Villiers and then the Earl of Buckingham in 1617. He is Marquess in 1618, and then he is a Duke in 1623. So within the period of nearly 10 years, he rises from the Gentleman of the Bedchamber to the Duke of Buckingham very, very quickly, receiving extensive land grants, receiving very, very prestigious court positions, and he's consolidated enormous amounts of power in this time. His relationship with James is very much well documented. James wrote to Villiers with endearments such as, quote, "my sweet child and wife," and, quote, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." Again, historians will continue to debate their relationship, whether it is romantic or platonic, but its intensity is definitely very well documented. In terms of his political role, as I've mentioned, he dominated court politics from 1618 to the death of James in 1625. It's very, very clear just how much of a rise of power he gets from 1615 to 1623. He plays a very key role in some areas of foreign policy, especially the failed Spanish match and the military expeditions such as the ill-fated Cadiz expedition that takes place under Charles I. We'll get to that in future lessons. He also maintained a position under Charles I, but was widely resented by Parliament and by the public. And his fall from grace is quite quite sharp, let's just say. He is assassinated, in fact, in 1628 by a naval officer by the name of John Feltham, who blamed him for military failures and for national decline. The death of the Duke of Buckingham was met with widespread public rejoicing, in fact, because of just how unpopular he was. And in fact, the fact that there was so much rejoicing in his death is revealing of his unpopularity. But it's his significance that is so important to think about. His rise exemplifies the dangers of excessive royal favouritism. The reign of James I really does lay the foundations of what will eventually become the clash between Charles and Parliament, given just how extravagant James was, just how much he would essentially have the ear, or they would have, or random courtiers would have the ear of him if he took a personal affection to them. His dominance, specifically the Duke of Buckingham's dominance, contributed to the tensions between Crown and Parliament, but not so much under James I, especially and more specifically under Charles I, this would help set the stage for the English Civil War. And so ultimately, we can see that it's a pattern of personal affection that drives political appointments. Lennox, Somerset, and Buckingham all were individuals who were personally close to James I, but it would have often destabilising consequences. It often alienated other courtiers, it would often alienate Parliament, it encouraged factionalism within the court, and it also contributed to a number of scandals, such as the Overbury murder and the Spanish match under Charles I. So these relationships reveal a lot about the sort of the court culture of the early Stuart monarchy, and it's important that we have these names in mind when we think about it, and when we think about the relationship between the Crown and Parliament as we get through these videos in future lessons.